Cheech here with Skill Builder number 32. On this Skill Builder, we're going to talk about matching hooks to beads, size-wise. Watch it, it's critical. We're going to talk about burned mono eyes for damsels or caddis. We're also going to talk about multiple ways to tie in a marabou tail.
That's a big brown.
Beads, beads, beads. What? Sizing, slotted, countersunk. Give me a chart. Teardrop beads, hook gap. Hook gap's an important one. Tungsten or brass. We're going to touch on some of this. The main things I want to talk about are the sizing and why that is so critical. We'll talk a little bit about a chart and why that's kind of not out there. But before we get going, tungsten versus brass, all you need to know is tungsten is probably more readily available. It's a more popular option now. And it sinks roughly 6.34 times faster than brass. Don't check my math on that, but I bet I'm pretty close. All right, so we're going to draw ourselves a little hook. But before we do that, I guess we'll do this first. So we have countersunk beads, which the front of the countersunk bead has a small hole and the back has a large hole. The reason for this is there needs to be a little bit of wiggle room, so when you slide it up over your hook eye or your hook point, it will make it over the bend and be able to be seated behind the hook eye. Countersunk. We're going to talk about slotted beads. So the front of a slotted bead, those are squeaky. Slotted bead also has a small hole in the front, but in the back there's a hole that looks like this. Okay. And the slotted bead is designed for mostly jig hooks, but it allows you to put the bead over maybe a weird curve on a hook. It allows you to put a bead on a jig hook where there's a little jog right before the hook eye that you need to slide it up over. So that is a slotted bead. And then you have these teardrop beads that kind of look like, let's see, they're kind of shaped like that, like a misshapen egg or something. So on the front of that, it's got a hole like this, and on the back of it, it kind of has a hole with a little bit of a concave section. So there's a little bit of difference front and back to that, and the way you tie it in can make your fly ride differently. So these are called, I don't know, we're going to call them teardrop beads. And you can tie balanced flies. You've seen all this kind of stuff. There are all kinds of names for these. So there you have it. Those are the main types of beads we're going to talk about here. So now that that's out of the way, we're going to talk about applications for these, mostly that's countersunk and slotted. But before we get too far into the different types of beads, we're just going to go over a little bit of hook anatomy. So here we have a normal hook. That would actually be like a long shank, maybe curved hook. There are hooks that look just like this, all right? So we talked in a hook sizing type discussion in a previous skill builder about the hook anatomy, and I think this little fella right here is one of the most important parts. That's the hook gap. So the hook gap is the business end of the hook that has the point right here, but it's the opening that allows you to hook a fish. For example, if you had a fly with a whole bunch of like deer hair coming out all throughout the fly, you know, really overdressed, what's going to happen is your hook gap's going to be buried right there. Okay, and we have Mr. Angry Fishy here, and he is just wanting to munch on this fly. He's got evil look in his eye. He's got the turbo tail, shark gills, and he just wants to eat that sucker. All right, well, guess what? Sorry, buddy, you can't, because our hook point is covered up. Now, you might be able to hook fish through that, but it's always best to size your fly based on the end result. If it's going to have a whole bunch of materials, a fly like this probably needs to be like this big. All right, so That's why hook gap is so important. Anything you do to impede or bulk up that hook gap, you're going to have a harder time catching fish. So, on a bead discussion, it looks like this. So here's our hook again. Boom. And a normal hook size for this hook, we don't even need to know the sizing. We're just going to look at, again, the gap. Right? Not the place that sells freaking preppy clothes. But I would say a good hook size, you know, something like that. Something like this would be fine as well. So as you can see, the center axis of these countersunk beads goes right through the middle of that hook, just based on how the hole is drilled. It's different for a slotted bead, and we'll go over that in a second. So if I keep going sized up on my beads, now you can see that my hook gap is very, very small. At this point, this biggest circle that I drew is too big of a bead for this hook, just based on a judgment call that it eats up more than half of my hook gap. Here I'm only using about a third of my hook gap, which I would say is pretty acceptable. All right, so the more junk you have in front of here that is not going to allow your hook gap to penetrate a hook mouth, that's where all your problems lie. Okay, now some companies go by millimeters, some go by imperial. So which one do you go by? And the answer is, like, think about it. Sometimes the imperial brands are they're gonna translate their millimeters to like a 3.3 millimeter. And another brand of hooks are gonna have a 3.5 millimeter. And if you think about, that's 0.2 millimeters worth of difference on those beads, so they're essentially the exact same size, in my opinion. So don't put too much stock in the actual sizing of your beads. Find something that's going to sit on the hook the way that you intend it, and it's not going to eat up too much hook gap. So there we have it, countersunk beads on a normal hook shank. Now I'm going to show you what happens when we use a slotted bead on a jig hook. So most jig hooks have an eye that's turned this way, 60-degree bend-ish, and it comes up like this. All right. So the cool thing about a jig hook is it's going to ride hook point up, and anytime, you know, here's our hook gap. Anytime we have a jig hook, it allows the bead, once the slot goes up over this jig portion, where the most of the bulk of that bead is going to be on the outside of the hook gap. So it's going to sit in there kind of like this. All right. So as you can see, that doesn't bulk up our hook gap very much at all. And even if it was, you know, it was designed a little tighter fit, you're still going to have that bead about like this. Okay. So what happens is, as you go bigger and bigger on your sizes of beads, it doesn't eat up into your hook gap very much. And this is a good point. If you have a bead where some of them sit kind of higher up like this, and some of them sit lower like this, it means you need to take this bead back here, rotate it 180 degrees, and then put it back. And then it will snap right into place. But anyway, if you use bigger beads on a jig hook, you can get pretty ridiculous size. You know, I mean, it's going to come up here a little more. Let's be fair. But it takes quite a large bead before you start making really big differences in the hook gap, because most of the bulk is on the outside of the hook gap. All right, I know that looks super confusing, but at the end of the day, you can have a jig hook. Let's say this is a size 16, right? And you can put a 2.5 mil bead on it, you can put a 3 mil bead on it, you can put a 3.5 mil bead on it. By the time you get to 4, it might be too much. But the beauty of a jig hook is, and this is why there's really no hook sizing chart that works for this, it depends on the brand of bead and the brand of hook sometimes. But at the end of the day, you can have a size 16 hook with a 2 mil, a 2.5, a 3, a 3.5, maybe even a 4 mil bead on a size 16 hook that will still work. So my suggestion is, if you need a lot of weight on your hooks or on your flies, tie them on jigs. You're going to be able to get a lot more weight in there without burning up that hook gap. All right, so there we go. Slotted beads, and we're clear. There is no sizing chart that's going to help you there. Kind of a general idea. There are lots of kinds of things like that, but this is why more of a standard doesn't exist in the industry. So the teardrop beads are actually awesome as well, because you're going to put really a ton of bulk on the outside. So they just add a lot more bulk toward the outside, and sometimes you can even time in a configuration where it pushes the weight further in front of the bead, which we've shown on several videos, and it makes almost a balanced fly. So we don't need to go into that too much, but you can use those the teardrop beads on either jig hooks or standard hooks, and it's just a good way to get a bunch of weight outside of the hook gap. Okay, so at the end of the day, there's really no chart that's going to be super accurate for this. Okay, and it sucks because if you're a beginner, you just kind of have to play with beads. And if you know this stuff, if you know the hook gap is important, then it doesn't matter how many books you read. You can just get hooks and beads, size them together and say, oh no, that's too much hook gap I've eaten up, or we're in. In fact, I'm going to put a bigger bead on there. So there you have it. Tie with beads and be happy. This is Brigham being happy. Burn. All right, happy tying. That's you, Brig. We're going to go over a really cool method for making monofilament eyes. This is a real simple one. We're trying to get it in two different camera angles because we have clear monofilament, black background, but this is focused. Brigham's dialed. He's finally doing his job the right way. Anyway, this is, I think, 40-pound test. You do have to have really thick monofilament for this, because if you don't, it's not going to burn quite right. So what I'm going to do is let's say I'm going to do a damselfly. Even for like a size 10 damsel, I'm going to use a 40-pound tippet. So I got one of these cool new micro tip D-loop tweezers from Loon. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab about, I don't know, that much. And I'll clip it off the other side, about equal. And you can use whatever tweezer you like, but we just need to have a little bit of room on each side to burn it. Okay, so from here, I'm just going to take my lighter and just barely touch the lighter up against that. We don't want to catch it on fire, but if it does, you just hurry and put it out. And you let that kind of melt up into a ball. See, it caught on fire, I hurried and put it out, and sometimes you have to move it around, but you can see that's a perfect little monofilament ball. I'm going to do the other side. Same thing. Blew that one out. So anyway, there's our monofilament eye right there. So one other cool thing you can do with this is, let's say you wanted colored eyes. You could take a marker, whatever you like, and just go around them like that. So you can make colored eyes, and if you want them more bulky, you can even take UV resin and put it on the outside of them. And I'll show you how to do that. I have some resin. I think this is medium solar res, but what I'm going to do is just barely coat the outside of these. You really don't want to bulk them up too much. We're just going to get them a little bit dirty. That increases the size of the eye. It gives a little bit of translucency. But this is how you would like increase the eye of the bulb. All right, so once we have that, we're just going to cure that. So you can see there's all kinds of cool stuff that you can do to make eyes. So this one's a little pink one. You can do black, red, all of the above. They're excellent for damselflies, caddis, whatever you need to have a cool light on. Sorry, my light was on. I meant to say whatever you need a cool eye on. Okay, let's talk about Marabou. Somebody left us a comment and wanted to talk about tying in Marabou tails. Either that, or it's just Brigham's buddy Manny, who really sucks at tying. We need to spell everything out for him. Okay, so I say that because I know Brig will leave them in. So we're going to talk about tying streamer tails. There are a few different ways to do this, and we're not going to talk about blood quills versus prime long versus woolly bugger marabou. We're just going to talk about marabou in general and how to make good use of it. Okay, so first of all, when you get marabou, it usually comes strung in a pack like this. Okay, and it's impossible to pull these out of here. So first little hack: take your scissors, and you don't even need to just cut the strings. You can just come in here and just make a big chop like that. Okay. From here you can kind of pull out some of the feathers, and some of them you will have to throw away. But even though these are looking absolutely terrible, these are all almost super usable feathers. You might have to, I don't like this one where it's all kind of flat on the top. But if I were to, say, tie woolly buggers out of this kind of stuff, I like to take the marabou off the side of the feather for woolly buggers. So let's just say we're going to grab this guy right here. It looks terrible. All I have to do is come down here, kind of brush that down, and then I'm just going to grab that last ½ inch and pop that off. So now look at that, I have a totally prepared feather. And now that I've done that, you know, you look at that and you're like, wow, that's a really nice marabou feather, and it took me about 4 seconds to do that. Sorry about the hat in the way. But here we have a marabou feather. Then you can either tie it in with the tips like this, like that. There's your tail as the tips, or you can pull it from the side. Now this one I don't really like for the tips because you can see how really fine that gets up here, and most of the bulk of this feather is down here. So this is a feather I'd maybe put aside for, you know, palmering a marabou soft hackle or pulling it off the sides. So there are a few ways you can go about this. I like to keep it pretty simple, where I'll just grab the feathers like this, pull it, and you can take the feathers and lay it right back on top, lining up the stem with the other feathers, grab it and pull it again. Then you're going to take these, fold those kind of in half, bunch them up, and then you have a really nice chunk of marabou to tie in. Now see how these are a little bit shorter than these back here. That's awesome. You don't want anything that's just straight across, so that just builds into that taper as it goes back, and it helps your marabou move quite a bit. Okay, so there's one way if you're pulling it off the sides. Another way is just to tie it in by the tips. I think this one's going to be a good one to do that way, even though it looks absolutely terrible. It looks like Brigham's nine-eye when he wakes up from a nap and he's been sucking on the corner of it the whole night, so check that out. Looks terrible.
What? What did you call it?
A nine-eye. That's what babies call them. Okay, so on this feather, this is a really nice feather. This has great flow. This is an ideal marabou feather, and it was maybe in the throwaway pile a few minutes ago. All right, oh sorry, I didn't do this part. That's why you do that. It looks like that. So now I've got a really nice feather, and if I were to pull it off the sides, you know, we already showed you that, but if you were to pull this up like this, it will go in just fine. But sometimes if it's too bulky through here, you can actually take a little bit more of this off, and if you were into saving marabou, you'd put that aside and do some buggers with it. But now this is ideal to tie in as a tail. As you can see right here where we're going to tie that into the fly, it's really small, nice and compact, and that's going to add a lot of movement as well. I like this style of fly on bigger, heavier flies where I don't want the marabou just to get everywhere. It kind of stays in its place a little bit more. So that's how I would tie it in, using the tips of the marabou. And obviously if you find some marabou that doesn't have, you know, tips that are aligned, chuck it or use it for a different purpose. But not all marabou is created equally, and just in a package like this you find all different types of marabou. Okay, so here's method one. This is that marabou that we farmed out. We're going to tie it in as a tail. One little hack that you can do with this is, now if I trim this, let's say I want my tail to be that long-ish. If I cut this to length, and I were to tie this down, there's a big bump right here. And on some flies you don't want much bulk here. So what you can do, and we've shown this before, this is something I learned from Davey McPhail from watching his videos. I'm taking my thumbnail and I'm just pinching those feather fibers out or off of the stem. And then when I wrap that on, it's going to be almost no bulk. This is awesome because when you're tying in a tail like this, you can get like 3 different colors if you want and just stack them. So that is method number 1 that I like to do to tie in tails. Method number 2 that we showed you is with this fella right here that we prepped, and we're going to use the tips of this one. And this one I'm just going to tie in. I mean, you can clean out the barbs like I did last time, but I'm going to show you another way to make a nice uniform body. So let's say we're going to tie it in like this. And this is actually a tip that I learned from Kelly Gallup watching his Marabou videos. It's a great point because if you leave the Marabou here, when you wrap this up the body of your fly, it's going to be way too bulky. Bulkier flies aren't going to be as durable because they kind of move around on the hook. So trim it down, makes sense. Freaking learn one thing from Kelly at least. All right, so I like to lift my Marabou up, pull or advance my thread forward. Then I catch my Marabou in the front, few wraps, trim it off, and then the next thing you're going to tie in usually is right up next to the tail. So now you're just going to take that and wrap it back to where you started. Okay, man, you could probably fish that. Maybe we should make a fly called the half arse. You know what I'm saying? All right, so that is method 2. But what you came to this skill builder for is method 3, the level maybe 4 out of 5 difficulty way to put a Marabou tail on a hook. Right? Everybody wants to just overcomplicate their flies. So this is a really cool method that I've done on the Drunk Drea and some other flies. And if you haven't watched that fly, that's maybe my most effective single hooked streamer. And it will make you throw things at your wall. So, you know, buckle up. But anyway, I'm going to farm out 2 more pieces of Marabou, and I'll try to do it with 2 different colored pieces. Okay, this one, if you like everything to be perfectly nice and tidy and organized all the time like me, this is going to drive you nuts because this method is maybe the coolest, but it looks the worst at first. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to take an orange and brown. It is late October here in Utah, 2024, and so we're doing some season specific. You don't want to do Christmas colors in October. It's kind of like putting the wrong soap in your wife's bathroom after you use the last of it. Stand down, my man. Okay, so what I did is I put these 2 pieces of Marabou back to back, and I'm going to grab them both by the tips. And if you do this right, you'll grab the part of the Marabou where that stem goes up through, and if you preen it down lightly, you can find 2 little very end tips of the Marabou, and that's what we're going to tie in. Okay, so that is easier said than done. And again, this is going to be pretty messy before it gets clean. So we're just going to leave those in. You can just take these and fold them back if you want, but we're plenty tied down. And now here's where the fun starts. So we're going to take these pieces of Marabou and just lay them on top of each other. Wait, one twisted. This, I told you, this is treacherous territory. Okay, so here we have the pieces of Marabou, and I've got them by these 2 pieces that there are 2 sections that I've prepared. And I'm just going to turn those, and very gently on the first 2 turns, make about 2 turns, and the fibers will trap all down like this. It's fine. Okay, now you can use a little bit more pressure, and I'm just going to start wrapping that forward until I feel like I have enough Marabou for a tail. Let's say stop right there. So what I can do here is I'm going to just clear out a little path if you want. Put your thread up through there and catch it and tie it down. That's another part that's treacherous territory, is getting that tied down without just matting everything down. So my scissors now are just going to come in here and find the stems. And now check that out. If I want to use these again, I have more marabou I can pull off the side and probably make 2 or 3 more flies out of the rest. Okay, so that's not a very durable tie down, so I'm just going to pull it back and just put a few turns over that right now. Okay, so once I have that, I can take just a comb and I can brush that whole thing out and back. And you can see that this marabou does not stay matted down at all. It'll pull right out. And then I'm just going to pull all of this back and slightly upward like that. Okay? And then just take your thread, your wrap back. Oh no, I broke my thread. Watch this. Brigham. You're going to see some professional skills. I had another bobbin over there because Brigham never cleans up my messes. Okay, so we started halfway. We're going to lift that back upward and just kind of take your thread back. And now when you let go of that, check that out. You have a perfectly modeled tail, and the body doesn't look very good, but look how nice that tail is. And you can add 3 colors in there if you want. So anyway, that's a really cool way to make a perfectly blended tail out of 2 colors.